In this short video, I would like to mention how the authoritarian regimes in Latin America have been targeting universities and university actors. The regular attributes for authoritarian regimes and populist regimes in Latin America has been identified as the ones I'm going to mention: the violation of the principle of separation of powers, the subordination of the electoral bodies and the judiciary to the executive power, the violation against freedom of expression and the press from independent and critical journalism, the rejection of any form of international scrutiny in matters of democracy and human rights. Other characteristic is the repeated actions of bread and circus, as in Roman Empire, in order to manipulate those most in need. What I want to say is that the situation of the universities and the universities actors, I mean professors and students, as targets of the authoritarian regimes is also a very important attribute of the new populist and authoritarian regimes in Latin America. And it's very important to identify that the authoritarian regimes has different targets. For example, the journalists, for example, the opposition politician, for example, the human rights defenders who criticize them, but also they have as targets the university professors who are critical, or also the students who protest or who defend the idea of democracy. And that's the point of this gap. In this sense, I would like to highlight how the neo-authoritarian and trend populisms in Latin America have developed state practices or policies targeting critical academics and universities. But also we should have into consideration that some violations come from authorities of the universities when they neutralize or silence the critical thinking of professors and students. Attention must be paid to overcoming ideological leanings because it represents a human rights problem. It's not just a matter of left or right thinking. And in the first video, I just mentioned some examples about how some Venezuelan authorities, I mean the National Constituent Assembly President Diosdado Cabello, threats on the Academy of Physics, Mathematics and Natural Sciences for the report on the situation of the coronavirus in Venezuela in May 2020, or the situation of the professor Freddy Pachano, who is the director of the medicine graduate studies in University of Sul State, who was under threats because he expressed some concerns about the coronavirus situation in March of 2020, and after that the governor of Sul State threatened him on any kind of retaliations. But it is very important to say that these patterns, these practices are not only repeated in Venezuela. For instance, in Nicaragua, on March 2020, Professor Miguel Orozco, the director of the Center for Health and Research Studies at UNAM Managua, mentioned to the BBC Mundo and in an interview some concerns about the pandemic. 1 month later, he and 3 colleagues of his team were dismissed by universities authorities. I would like to highlight the relationship between academic freedom and other human rights, such as the right to health in these cases. Without the reports and opinions based on scientific knowledge, Venezuelan and also Nicaraguan societies will be more vulnerable to the coronavirus pandemic due to the inaccessibility to qualified information which may contrast governmental policies on the pandemic. Other patterns that has been documented by Aula Abierta's NGO Observatory on Academic Freedom in Latin America, for example, are in Cuba, the dismissal and subsequent imprisonment of professor and biologist Ariel Urquiola, following his environmental investigation and his participation in the defense of human rights in 2016. But he was also under different kinds of retaliations in 2017, 18, 19. He also denounced having been infected with HIV during his release process. In 2019, the Cuban Vice Minister of Higher Education threatened all professors who don't follow party's revolutionary policies, morality, and ideology of the Cuban Revolution. So universities itself should be pluralistic, should work for democracy. This is an example of the imposition that only one ideology is allowed in the case of Cuba, in the Cuban universities. In Venezuela, economic science professor at University of Carabobo, Santiago Guevara, was arbitrarily detained in 2017 and brought before military courts after publishing articles, papers on the economic situation of the country. In the framework of his trial, the prosecutor presented his academic papers and books as evidence of his crimes. In Ecuador, a judge of the Ecuadorian Supreme Court and university professor at the Andean University, Ramiro Avila, was banned from hearing a constitutional case regarding mining in the province of Azuay due to his previous scientific research papers against extractivism, which, in the opinion of the court, proved an interest in the cause. However, scholars are not only attacked because of their scientific research. They also, as university authorities, face attacks due to their participation in the discussion of public affairs. Unfortunately, attacks intensified in Latin America during recent years. So it is very important to highlight the idea that academic freedom protects not only the production and transfer of scientific knowledge, it's very important for democracy, it's very important for development, but also protects the idea that the universities are the space for democracies, and the university actors should contribute to democracies. So the university actors, especially professors, but also students, should contribute with democracies, contribute with the critical thinking, contribute with the critical debate in the society. In Venezuela, in 2019, a legal document was issued by the National Council of Universities, which requested to initiate a criminal inquiry against the rectors, members of the AVERU, the Rector Association, for not recognizing the de facto government of Nicolás Maduro. This pattern has been documented also in Bolivia, with threats and violence against the rector of San Andrés Major University, Waldo Albarracín, and the rector of Central American University, José Idiáquez, in Nicaragua. Universities represent the cradle of scientific knowledge. They should defend the rule of law and democracy. In this sense, the scope of academic freedom should include the protection of the participation of scholars, no matter the role they play as authorities, researchers, professors, also students, when they are advocating in favor of democracy. Another pattern against academic freedom in Latin America is a criminalization of university actors, scholars, and students who protest. In 2009, former president of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, gave orders to police and military forces to violently repress students on the streets in Venezuela when they would protest.
ministro del Interior, écheles gas. Écheles gas y disuelva cualquier guarimba. No se puede permitir a nadie que tranque una avenida o una calle o una autopista. No se puede permitir. A estos grupitos direccionados por el imperio, se los digo, y doy la orden de una vez, no hace falta que me pidan permiso, me le echan gas del bueno y me lo meten preso.
Unfortunately, violence is often repeated in Latin America through practices from police, military, and in some cases, parastatal groups. Between 2017 and 2020, our Observatory on Academic Freedom in Latin America documented within Bolivia, Colombia, Cuba, Honduras, Nicaragua, and also in Venezuela that over 450 university students have been arbitrarily detained during social protests. Also, more than 100 university students have been expelled from the universities. At least 30 students have been murdered and many others have been wounded, subjected to torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment for exercising their role as critical thinkers and their right to demonstrate. Both scientific knowledge generated through the scientific method and critical debate in academic discussions inside or outside the universities. And so it's very important to talk about the extramural speech should always be possible and be welcome. Another pattern against academic freedom in Latin America is the expulsion and arbitrary dismissal as a practice of discrimination on political grounds or after advocating human rights. Aula Abierta, Open Class NGO, documented a case where 40 students from the National Agrarian University in Nicaragua were suspended and expelled for organizing a public demonstration denouncing fraud in the elections for students' representatives in December 2019. Recently in Venezuela, we denounced cases on reprisals against university students and professors for expressing their opinion in public matters. For example, Franklin Camargo, a medicine student who was arbitrarily expelled. During a medicine class, he criticized his professor, claimed that the students should swear a new socialistic oath supporting Nicolás Maduro, instead the Hippocratic Oath. It was in 2019. In Colombia, for example, Monica Godoy was fired from the University of Ibagué in 2017 for reporting violence against women. Fortunately, Colombian Constitutional Court ruled supporting her human rights. And I would like to mention also the three last patterns documented by our Observatory in Latin America on Academic Freedom is the censorship in the dissemination and discussion of documentaries on university campuses, the self-censorship after threats, and the last one, the indirect violations of academic freedom. Regarding the censorship in the dissemination and discussion of documentaries, I would like to highlight that in Venezuela, it was produced a ban on the analysis of the documentary film, The Chavism's The Plague of the 21st Century, Chavismo, la peste del siglo XXI, in Spanish. In 2019, a criminal court in Caracas prohibited its dissemination within the University Simón Bolívar and any other public space, restricting to discuss it through academic dissertations. Regarding the self-censorship after threats, in 2019, at the conference on Maracaibo's Day, the City Day of Maracaibo, engineering professors of the University of Zulia State did not participate for fear of retaliation, after they received threats if they analyze the electrical problems in Venezuela. It's very important to say that Venezuela experiences, and Maracaibo experiences, long blackouts of around 10 hours every day. And regarding the last pattern in direct violations of human rights, Aula Abierta has registered in Bolivia, in Venezuela, and also in Nicaragua, budget restrictions as retaliations against universities after they have produced scientific uncomfortable reports in a critical way to the government. We also denounced the siege against universities from several authorities, having registered, for example, in Venezuela, at least 50 judicial decisions since 2010 against universities, against the decisions of the universities' councils, and restricting autonomy of the universities. It is very notable that Bolsonaro in Brazil and López Obrador in Mexico, when they became president some years ago, they announced budget restrictions against universities. Those situations can be defined as indirect violations of academic freedom. In order to conclude, it is very important to make a recommendation to states. According to the General Comment number 13 from the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the right to education, like all human rights, imposes 3 types or levels of obligations on states parties: the obligations to respect, to protect, and to fulfill. But also it's very important to make some recommendations to civil society. We as NGOs, as universities, actors or institutions, human rights centers from universities, to fight in favor of academic freedom in domestic frameworks and abroad, to increase research and advocacy work on academic freedom situations. There are very few organizations that work and do research on the matter to develop strategic litigation actions at the international level before international human rights bodies. Thank you for watching this short video. In the final video, I will tell you more about the debate that is going on the subjects that are under protection by academic freedom, and what are the limits on academic freedom. If you are interested on the work of Aula Abierta, Open Class NGO, please see our websites and social networking.